was a snowy, frigid night when I pulled into the gas station's parking lot for my usual overnight shift. The kind of cold that bites through your clothes and settles in your bones. I'd been working here for a few months, and while the job wasn't anything to write home about, the night shifts fit my life. With everything else going on, the solitude and quiet of the graveyard shift were almost comforting. As I parked beside the only other car in the lot, my coworkers, I let out a weary sigh. The routine was the same: a quick handover, a few mumbled words, and then I was alone, left to face the long, cold hours ahead. My manager had left a list of tasks, but they weren't enough to fill the night. I decided to put them off, knowing that if I started too soon, I'd be fighting off sleep before the clock even struck midnight. Around midnight, the silence was broken by the low rumble of an engine as a beat-up old SUV pulled into the station. The vehicle crept to a stop by one of the pumps, and for a moment I barely registered it. Late-night drivers were rare in this weather, but not impossible. With the snow swirling outside, I figured someone had braved the cold for a quick fill-up and went back to scrolling through my phone, trying to keep myself awake. 10 minutes passed, and out of habit, I glanced out the window. The SUV was still there, but something was off. The headlights were off, the engine silent, and the doors remained closed. Whoever was inside hadn't made a move to pump gas or come inside the store. My curiosity quickly turned to concern. Who would sit in a freezing car with the engine off for that long? Bundling up in my jacket, I stepped outside into the biting cold. The wind cut through me, making me shiver as I approached the SUV. The windows were dark, and as I pressed my face closer to the glass, I called out, hoping for a response. But the interior was pitch black, and no one answered. The car looked abandoned, like its driver had vanished into thin air. Shivering and confused, I started to head back inside when something caught my eye. A set of fresh footprints in the snow. They led away from the SUV, not toward the front of the building where I was standing, but off to the side, disappearing around the corner. My pulse quickened as I stared at those prints, realizing that someone had been here recently and was now somewhere nearby. After huddling next to the small heater for what felt like just a moment, a loud thump echoed from the back of the store, snapping me out of my daze. My heart pounded as I spun around, eyes darting across the room. At first, I saw nothing, just the dull, sterile glow of the fluorescent lights reflecting off the wet floor. But then, I noticed the puddles of melted snow leading from the door, trailing toward the supply room in the back. Dread tightened in my chest as I forced myself to move, creeping toward the darkened room. The air felt heavier, thick with the sense that something was very, very wrong. As I rounded the corner, my breath caught in my throat. There, partially obscured by one of the shelves, stood a man. A tall, imposing figure with broad shoulders and a scruffy beard. He was just standing there, staring at me, his eyes locked onto mine. For a moment, I was paralyzed, unable to process what I was seeing. Then, instinct kicked in. I backed away slowly, trying not to make any sudden moves until I reached the counter. With shaking hands, I grabbed the phone and dialed the police, whispering as quietly as I could for help, all the while keeping my eyes on the figure in the back. The next 10 minutes felt like an eternity. The man never moved, never made a sound, but his presence filled the room with an unbearable tension. I could feel my pulse in my ears, the silence almost deafening as I waited. When the flashing lights finally appeared outside, I felt a brief surge of relief, but it was quickly replaced by cold terror. The police arrived and I quickly told them about the man. They moved through the store, their flashlights cutting through the dim light as they searched the supply room. But when they came back, their faces were a mix of confusion and concern. The man was gone. There was no sign of him, just a trail of watery footprints leading out the back door and into the vast, dark field behind the station. A field that stretched on for miles, empty and desolate. Over the next few days, the police searched the area thoroughly, but they found nothing. No tracks, no signs of life, nothing. The BMW was taken in, but it yielded no answers either. It was as if the man had simply vanished, leaving behind a chilling mystery that no one could solve. To this day, I still have no idea who he was, what he wanted, or where he went. The encounter haunts me, replaying in my mind whenever I find myself alone at night. The fear, the uncertainty, it's something I can't shake, no matter how hard I try. All I'm left with are the memories of that snowy night and the unanswered questions that continue to gnaw at me. During my high school years, I worked at a small restaurant nestled in an outlet shopping center with my older brother. It wasn't the busiest place, but it kept us occupied. We were both waiters, though with such a small staff, our roles often expanded beyond just serving food. We'd find ourselves washing dishes, making deliveries, or handling whatever task needed doing. My brother and I got into a good rhythm, but after a year, he graduated and left for college. That left me to continue working there alone. The job was routine, nothing special, at least until one Friday night when everything changed. That particular night, I was scheduled to close the restaurant alongside the manager. It was an unusual shift for me since I usually left by 9 p.m. due to school. The restaurant stayed open until midnight, but that late night lull was new to me. The evening had been quiet, with only a few takeout orders trickling in after 8 p.m. I remember how the silence inside the restaurant felt almost calming. The kind of quiet that made you feel like the world outside was slowly drifting off to sleep. Then, around 10:30 p.m., my manager picked up a phone call for a delivery. It seemed strange to get an order that late, but we didn't think much of it at the time. By 11 p.m., I was out the door, food in hand, heading to the address the customer provided. It was just another delivery, nothing out of the ordinary, or so I thought. The address I was given was supposed to be just 8 minutes away, a quick delivery to end the night, but a few minutes into the drive, my phone rang. It was my manager. The customer had called back, claiming they'd given the wrong address. I pulled over, scribbling down the new location on a napkin. As I typed it into the GPS, something didn't feel right. The new address was 25 minutes away, in the complete opposite direction from where I was headed. It seemed odd, but I was already out, and the food was ready. Turning back didn't feel like an option, so I reluctantly kept driving. The later it got, the emptier the roads became. Streetlights grew sparse, and soon the town seemed to dissolve into nothingness. I hadn't seen another car in what felt like forever. Instead of the familiar suburban sprawl, I was now surrounded by vast open fields and thick clusters of trees. The isolation was unnerving, but I pushed through, telling myself it was just another delivery. When I finally turned onto the road with the address, I was struck by how desolate it felt. The houses lining the street were dark, most without any lights at all. The few that did have a faint glow looked dilapidated, like they'd been forgotten by time. I pulled up in front of the house, a small, single-story structure that looked more like a shadow in the night than a home. There were no lights on, inside or out. The silence was oppressive, the kind that presses against your chest, making it hard to breathe. With a growing sense of unease, I grabbed the food and walked up to the door. The stillness around me felt unnatural, like the world was holding its breath. I knocked, the sound echoing in the emptiness. I waited and waited, but no one came to the door. After a full minute with no answer, I decided to leave the food on the doorstep. I hadn't been paid, but at that point, I just wanted to get out of there. As I turned to head back to my car, something caught my eye. A man, standing right behind my vehicle. He was bent over, peering inside through the window. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze, trying to process what I was seeing. He slowly straightened up and turned to face me. In the dim light, I couldn't make out his features clearly, but he was older, with a hunched posture. My mouth went dry as I called out, "Do you need something?" The man didn't respond. He just stood there, staring at me with an unsettling intensity. The uneasy feeling from earlier returned, stronger this time, spreading through me like ice. I glanced around, but there was nothing and no one else in sight. Just the empty houses and the trees in the distance. The isolation that had seemed eerie before now felt threatening. The man took a few steps back, his eyes never leaving mine. He positioned himself a few feet from my car door, blocking my way. The message was clear. I wasn't getting to my car without passing him first. I felt trapped, my mind racing as I tried to figure out what to do next. I stood there, frozen, trying to make sense of the situation. The man slowly straightened up and locked his gaze onto me. Even in the dim light, I could see he was older, but the details of his face were lost in shadow. His silence was unnerving. I asked again if he needed something, but he didn't respond. He just stood there, staring, as if waiting for something. The sense of dread that had been building inside me all night now felt like a weight pressing down on my chest. I looked around, hoping to see something, anything that could help me understand what was happening, but all I saw were trees and shadows. The man then took a few slow steps back, positioning himself just a few feet from my car door. I hesitated, feeling trapped, but I knew I had to leave. I started walking toward my car, keeping my eyes on him the entire time. He didn't move, but his gaze never wavered, following my every step. I reached the door, my hand shaking as I grabbed the handle. Just as I opened it, the man suddenly turned toward the woods and started screaming, his voice raw and primal, shattering the eerie silence of the night. I instinctively turned my head to see what he was looking at. And that's when I saw them. Figures. 2, maybe 3, emerging from the trees, moving quickly and purposefully toward me. My heart pounded in my chest as the realization hit me like a ton of bricks. This was a setup. Panic surged through me, and I jumped into the car, fumbling with the keys as I tried to start it. The man who had been standing next to me suddenly moved, trying to get behind the car, as if to block my escape. But I wasn't about to stick around and find out what they wanted. I slammed the car into reverse and hit the gas, narrowly missing him as I sped out of the spot. I caught a glimpse of the group running toward me, their shouts filling the night air, but I didn't look back. I drove as fast as I could, the adrenaline coursing through my veins, pushing me to get as far away from that place as possible. Later, when I was safe, the police were called. They investigated. But there wasn't much they could do. The house I was supposed to deliver to was vacant, the owners long gone, living out of state. It wasn't even for sale, just left to rot away for years. The person who placed the order was never identified, and the original address they had given seemed to have no connection to anything. As for the group of men who had appeared from the woods, their intentions remain a chilling mystery. To this day, I don't know what would have happened if I hadn't managed to get away. But I do know one thing. If even a single detail had played out differently that night, I might not be here to tell this story. In my 20s, I worked as an overnight lead at a small, local retail store. It wasn't a big chain, just one of those places with around 8 or 9 locations. Most nights I had someone else to help out, but it wasn't uncommon for me to be alone during my shift. The store was small, so the work wasn't demanding. Sometimes I'd even slow down just to avoid running out of things to do. One night, I was working alone, moving through my tasks at a steady pace. As I loaded up some boxes and moved into the aisles to start stocking shelves, my mind started to drift. It was just another quiet, uneventful night, and I wasn't paying much attention to my surroundings. That's when a loud knock at the front entrance jolted me back to reality. I nearly dropped the box I was holding, my heart skipping a beat. It took a moment for me to realize what I had heard. The knock came again, echoing through the store, louder this time. I felt a rush of confusion. Who would be knocking at this hour? The store was closed, and no one should be coming by this late. Curious and a bit uneasy, I walked down to the end of the aisle and peered through the large front windows. A man stood at the doors, a hood pulled over his head. The dim lighting outside cast shadows across his face, making it hard to see his features clearly. I approached the glass cautiously, raising my voice to be heard through the door. "We're closed. We won't be open until 8 a.m., I called out. The man didn't respond. He just stared at me through the glass, his face still obscured by the hood. I pointed to the sign on the door, repeating myself. "We're closed. Sorry." He continued to watch me for a few seconds longer before finally turning away and walking off into the night. I watched him until he disappeared from view, but I didn't see any car parked nearby. The whole encounter left me feeling unsettled, but I tried to shake it off. Maybe he was just confused or at the wrong place. Still, as I returned to stocking the shelves, I couldn't quite shake the feeling that something wasn't right. By 2 a.m., I had made decent progress through the aisles and decided it was time for a break. I left the half-unpacked boxes where they were and headed to the break room on the far side of the building. The store was eerily quiet as I made my way there, the hum of the fluorescent lights the only sound accompanying my footsteps. I sat down in the break room, trying to shake off the strange encounter from earlier. I stayed in there for about half an hour, absent-mindedly picking at my food until I finally decided to toss the rest of my lunch and get back to work. As I walked through the dimly lit store, something caught my eye just as I reached the aisle I had been working on. A man. No, the man was walking past the other end of the aisle. My blood ran cold as I recognized the same hooded figure I'd seen earlier. He moved casually, as if he belonged there, his footsteps echoing softly through the empty store. He didn't seem to notice me, but the sight of him stopped me dead in my tracks. Panic surged through me. I knew I had locked the doors. How did he get inside? My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, but there was no logical explanation. The fear that had been gnawing at me all night now exploded into full-blown terror. I listened intently, holding my breath, as I heard his footsteps moving toward the break room, the very place I had just been. My heart pounded in my chest, and I instinctively ducked behind the shelves, trying to stay out of sight. The store, which had felt like a safe, familiar place for so long, now felt like a trap. Just as I was gathering the courage to make a run for the front door, I heard the man rushing out of the break room. His footsteps were no longer calm and measured. They were fast, frantic, and getting closer. He was sprinting through the store, heading straight in my direction. I clamped a hand over my mouth to stifle a gasp, my mind racing with fear. There was no time to think, only time to react. I was cornered in a maze of shelves, the darkness pressing in around me, and the only way out was through him. Panicking, I bolted for the front door, my heart pounding so loudly I could barely hear my own footsteps. My hands shook uncontrollably as I fumbled with the keys, desperately trying to unlock the door. The sound of the man's footsteps thundering closer echoed through the aisles, driving my panic to new heights. Just as I managed to turn the key and push the door open, he appeared at the end of the aisle. His eyes locked on me with an intensity that sent a chill down my spine. I didn't think, I just acted. I threw myself through the door, feeling the cold night air hit my face as I stumbled outside. That's when I saw it. A bright flash out of the corner of my eye, followed by a deafening pop that sent shockwaves through my entire body. My ears rang from the gunshot, and for a split second I was paralyzed with fear, but I didn't dare stop to look back. I sprinted around the side of the building, my legs moving faster than they ever had before. I reached my car, yanked the door open, and dove into the back seat, slamming the door behind me. My hands shook so badly I could barely hold my phone, but I managed to dial 911, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I frantically told the operator what had happened. Every second felt like an eternity as I waited for the police to arrive, my eyes darting around, terrified that the man might find me again. When the police finally showed up, the man was gone. They searched the store and found the back door busted open, with heavy tools lying next to it, evidence that he had broken in. But what haunted me the most was what they found by the front doors. A bullet hole, mere inches from where I had been standing when I escaped, was lodged in the wall. If I had hesitated for even a second, I might not have made it out alive. The police speculated that the man had suffered some kind of mental breakdown or psychotic episode. They didn't think he had any specific reason to target me other than the fact that I was alone and vulnerable. To them, it was a random act of violence, a tragedy narrowly avoided. But for me, it was much more than that. The image of that man, The sound of his footsteps chasing me and the sight of that bullet hole have been burned into my memory. I no longer work at the store. But the fear from that night never truly left me. For years afterward, I lived in a constant state of anxiety, always looking over my shoulder, always afraid that he might come back. And even now, late at night, I sometimes find myself lying awake, wondering why I was the one he chose to terrorize, and if he's out there somewhere waiting for another opportunity